Okay, so this is somewhat of an opposite view of what we talked about before. In the previous podcast, the author Wolf argued about why it's scientifically inconsistent for scientists to engage in climate activism. And activism is where you are doing something to change something, right? So it's not just about engaging, it's making an effort. Protests, people are now doing strange things like throwing things on paintings in museums, stopping certain activities in the public, like uh, whatever. You can read a lot about what climate protests are like. Is protest the same as activism? Well, they are active uh, engagement in trying to change things or send a message for changing things. So let's see what this means. Climate change engagement of scientists. So do we mean the same thing when we say engagement versus activism? Remember in the last podcast we said scientists can communicate, can give public talks, engage in public debates on the science of climate change, etc. But activism is something else, right? Climate change is one of the biggest threats to humanity. Scientists are well positioned to help address it. Beyond conducting academic research, yet little is known about their wider engagement with the topic. The word engagement is used here, and it definitely also goes beyond their research. We investigate scientists' engagement with climate change using quantitative and qualitative analysis of a large scale. Why do I just tired. We investigate scientists' engagement with climate change using quantitative and qualitative analysis of a large-scale survey with a sample size of 9,220 across 115 countries, all fields and all career stages. So it's not just climate change. Many scientists already engage in individual lifestyle changes, but fewer engage in advocacy or activism. So there we are again with the activism. On the basis of our quantitative and qualitative results, we propose a two-step model of engagement to better understand why. Scientists must first overcome intellectual and practical barriers to be willing to engage, and then overcome additional barriers to actually engage. There may be people who understand the issues but not willing to engage, whatever it means in this context, as we'll see, and those who will be interested in engaging but feel there are some barriers, either intellectual or practical. On the basis of this model, we provide concrete recommendations for increasing scientists' engagement with climate change. And surveys exist all over the place, so we'll see what this survey is all about. Humanity is crossing multiple planetary boundaries, pushing the Earth system outside the safe operating space for humanity. We talked about planetary boundaries elsewhere, about, of course, greenhouse gases, biodiversity, nitrogen pollution, and so on, and say that we have some kind of a safe operating system which is defined by Rockstrom et al. Not everybody agrees with this. I'm not even sure what you can do with it, because globally integrated measures like this tell you, okay, we crossed some safe operating boundary, but it's made up of many local exceedances, and rich people may be exceeding it more than poor people, or poor people may not be exceeding. So how do you bring about action? Nonetheless, it's an integrated measure which has become very popular now. Climate change poses a particularly urgent threat with impacts considerably worse than predicted by earlier research. While some governments and corporations have made pledges to limit global heating to well below 2 degrees C, strategies to meet these pledges are lacking. So that's what we mean by also planetary boundaries. Mitigation and adaptation are obvious that they are needed, but there are all sorts of challenges to each of them. This leaves the world at high risk with projected global heating by the end of the century that may be beyond the capacity of human societies to adapt. Again, this is based on many assumptions that we have to see, but for sure we are reaching warming limits that we haven't seen since the beginning of the Holocene, when we became the most dominant species on the planet. So we are definitely not used to such warm temperatures. There is growing recognition that insufficient mitigation and adaptation is substantially due to resistance from actors who benefit from the status quo. These obstructors include not only fossil fuel companies making record profits and influencing policy making, but also wealthy, high-emitting individuals who, consciously or not, seek to protect their carbon-intensive lifestyles. So these are the crux of the matter here anyway. If we want to engage and do something, and we are influencing policy from the other side, are we better than the oil companies? If we are scientists and we are supposed to do science, getting paid to do science, then can we go and start influencing policy making? Does that make us better than others who are influencing policy? Overcoming this resistance and compelling governments to take decisive action against climate change requires bottom-up pressure from large parts of society. So if we help society understand the risks of climate change, that is still engagement, but that is not direct activism. Scientists and academics, henceforth scientists in general, are uniquely positioned to help mobilize society, given that they are among the most trusted groups in society and have broad access to important stakeholders, including media and governments. This is another important point, that society in general sees scientists as people who are doing something useful and can be trusted. But as we talked about in the previous podcast, if we are playing fast and loose with the narrative of climate change, its impacts, what will happen in the future and so on, are we jeopardizing the trust that people place in us? If we take the end justifies the means approach, will we be jeopardizing that trust? Scientists working on climate change may use their status and expertise to shape public opinion by informing the public about climate risks and solutions. So you are still on the safe side of using science to inform people, and then advocate for stronger policy, which is then going up against others from the other side who want to protect fossil fuels and so on. In addition, some have highlighted the role the wider scientific community could play in supporting climate movement, for instance, by sharing knowledge about social change, by joining protests which may lend credibility to the wider climate movement, and by educating students about the many facets of the climate crisis. So we are mixing everything here. By joining protests, as we talked about before in the previous podcast, there may be non-scientists who can speak the same language as a scientist, because now IPCC reports are wide open. Any educated person can listen to them, or they can learn from YouTube channels or whatever, and can sound very much like a scientist. And are they legitimate people to be joining protests and using their knowledge as credibility of being a scientist? Okay, so what are the kind of surveys? So descriptive statistics of key variables, beliefs about climate change and solutions, and then beliefs about responsibility and role of scientists, life behaviors, and advocacy and activism behaviors. So here, beliefs about climate change and solutions. Overall, how worried are you about climate change? Many such surveys exist. So here, not at all, very little, moderate amount, quite a bit, and a great deal. Okay, fundamental changes to society, politics, and economics required. Again, 66% are in this range of agreeing a great deal. Substantial changes to personal behavior and lifestyle required, only 38%. So somebody must do something, government, society, politics, economy, and should all change, but not many people will agree to behavior and lifestyle change for themselves. Environmental activist groups can drive positive change. Now only 19% strongly agree, and 50% agree. It's in this color here, which is quite a bit. Advances in technology will largely solve climate change problem is strongly agree is relatively small, and most people don't think so, and in fact 13% strongly disagree. okay, and 31% disagree. So strongly disagree and disagree. Responsibility and role of scientists and academics. Scientific or academic institutions are responsible. So that's 51%, let's say slight majority. Feel responsible as a scientist or academic. So that's even, about 35% agree and 33% agree a great deal. Scientists and academics should engage more advocacy. 39% agree quite a bit and 12% agree a great deal. Scientists and academics should engage more in legal protest, so that's a certain number, and there are many who disagree in these things. Engaging in advocacy would diminish scientists' credibility. 35% disagree with this statement, and there are some that agree or strongly agree, and many people are somewhere in the middle about disagreeing. So most people seem to, let's say, disagree that engaging in advocacy would diminish scientists' credibility. But there are a lot of details in the sense how you ask this question really matters, because the general public may not know the level of your expertise when you are talking. If you sound very coherent, they may agree, they may just think that you are an expert, right? Lifestyle behaviors, again, reducing car usage, a lot of people are already doing or agree quite a bit to do it. Reducing the amount of flying, already doing. Increasing energy efficiency at home, already doing. Following a mostly vegetarian or a vegan diet, 39%. Having fewer or no children, 36%. But as I have said elsewhere, this is really a carbon footprint problem in terms of a portfolio. So you may be reducing car usage but not necessarily eating less meat, or maybe doing many other things would put your carbon footprint at some level that is, let's say, not safe for the planet if we want to use the planetary boundaries kind of approach again. Advocacy and activism behaviors, talking about climate change with others. Many already do. Engaging in climate change advocacy, some 30% do. Donating to a relevant organization, 30% already do. Participating in legal climate change related protests, 23%, but 47% are willing to, which means there are barriers, intellectual and practical. Could be just time and so on. Participating in non-violent civil disobedience, 45% are willing and 10% are already doing, and 45% here are not willing to do in civil disobedience. 29% not willing to participate in climate change related protests. 22% donating, not willing to donate to relevant organizations and so on. So doesn't mean much other than what people are thinking. This is about the results of individual multi-level logistic regressions predicting engagement. Posterior means and 95% credible intervals for the contrasts willing to versus not willing to in orange, already do versus willing to do in green, for both advocacy and protest from the individual Bayesian multi-level logistic regression models. I won't go into the statistical details, but just pay attention to what the numbers say. We estimated one moderate, so there are some details here about the statistical robustness and approaches. So sample size, not willing to, willing to already, so this is a smaller. Protests for advocacy and protests, willing to is larger, and already doing is somewhere in the middle. Okay, here it's smaller than not willing to. Okay, so at the intellectual level, you are asking academics should protest more, activists can drive change, academics should advocate more, should worry, responsibility of all institutions, and so on and so forth. And there are also people who are not convinced of the impact. So you see that depending on the question, there are people who are already do versus willing to do. So that's percentage change, and willing to do, willing to versus not willing to. So you can do what you want with it, but basically this indicates that there are people willing to do many things like protest, and there are people who are not willing to do as well, donate, do legal protests or lifestyle changes informed on climate. Not much we can do, attitude and technology will solve the problem kind of thing, and so on and so forth. But it's a detailed analysis and it depends on the background as well. So whether it's a female, softer science like social science, let's say biology, etc., research relevant to climate or unrelated, carbon intensity of lifestyle. If you are living a high carbon lifestyle and saying yes, climate change is important and I'm willing to do something, but you are not changing your lifestyle, then it's just talk, right? Age, tenure, full professor, political orientation, non-binary, self-described, non-disclosed, and so on. And there are also kind of intrinsic personalities that are involved. Some people are intrinsically willing to protest and stand up for causes, relationships, and so on, and some are extrinsic personalities in the sense they look for image, wealth, power, etc. So does it depend on who is answering what? Well, in the end, I would say if you have a lot of solutions that make sense, that doesn't require you to think all these things, then you would just, if you're someone who loves iPhones, and you probably don't think about whether iPhone is carbon neutral or not. But if Apple worries about it and gives you a carbon neutral Apple, then you will be happy, and you sometimes pay more for green things, more efficient things, renewable energy, hybrid cars, and so on, right? So a lot of details are missed in these kind of analysis. Model for barriers to climate change engagement of scientists. So intellectual and practical barriers are here. Intellectual barriers include things like low levels of worry, lack of knowledge, lack of efficiency beliefs. So this is academic and practical. Not the role of scientists. Do not identify with activists and disagree with the activist ideology and strategy, etc. So here A is advocacy and A, not academics, I said it wrong, only for advocacy and for protests, or both for A and P. So here we are looking for advocacy and protests, only for protests, so do not identify with the activists, disagree with the activists' ideology and strategy, both advocacy and protests. Practical barriers, fear of losing credibility. This is something that many scientists think about. Unsuitable personality. No advocate in inner circle. Lack of skills. Fear of repercussions. And this is something people are really worried about in some places where the monitoring of who is doing what can be very high, and you can think of which countries they are and which president may do more of a vengeful retribution than others, right? So on this side, intellectual and practical barriers, not the role of scientists for protest, lack of knowledge. So this is people who are willing to engage but face intellectual barriers and practical barriers. Lack of knowledge, own carbon footprint. So practical barriers include lack of skills, fear of losing credibility, not knowing any groups, lack of time, lack of opportunity, no advocate in the inner circle, and so on and so forth. Okay, so let's just look at discussions. I'm obviously keeping it short, but this is a different approach to doing this problem than the other previous podcast, because this is not at all worrying about the appropriateness of scientists engaging in protests and whether they should remain separated from activism while also being able to communicate, advocate, as opposed to active activism, where activism is you are doing something to change things. So you take it as you want and decide for yourself, right? Our large-scale investigation shows how scientists around the world view climate change, the extent to which they are engaged in climate action, and what barriers keep them from engaging more. Nearly all scientists agree that climate change is caused by human activities, and the large majority are worried about climate change and believe that addressing it requires fundamental changes in social, political, and economic systems. The majority also believe that scientists and academic institutions have a responsibility to reduce climate change. This is a fairly okay belief. There is nothing wrong with it. What you do about it is, or how you go about doing that, is what is more important in the sense of activism versus not overstating things, not having blind belief in whatever climate change projections are saying, and so on. Further, a sizable proportion are reported having engaged in advocacy and activism behaviors, and a large proportion reported being willing to do so. But it depends on what activism was considered here in their behavior. Barriers to climate change engagement. Despite serious concerns about climate change, most scientists did not report engaging in advocacy or protests. To better understand why, we synthesized our findings into a two-step model of barriers to engagement, as we saw here. In this model, scientists are initially either undecided or unwilling to engage, and first have to overcome a set of barriers to be willing to engage in principle, and then overcome additional barriers to actually engage. In both steps, we distinguish between intellectual and practical barriers and indicate whether they apply to engagement in advocacy or actual protests. In the first step, intellectual barriers of scientists' willingness to engage include low level of worry about climate change, little knowledge about the subject, doubts about the efficacy of advocacy or protest, not feeling responsible as citizens or scientists, and believing that it's not the role of scientists to engage in such behaviors. So, believing that it's not their job is not the same as saying, I'm a climate scientist, I benefit from climate funding, hence I'm not going to advocate for more funding and protest activists, be an activist for more climate funding. That's many subtle differences, so you have to be careful. In addition, not identifying with activists and disagreeing with their ideology and strategy emerged as an intellectual barrier for willingness to join protests. Practical barriers to being willing to engage include the fear of losing credibility, perceiving oneself to have an unsuitable personality, and not having an advocate activist in one's inner circle, so nobody to motivate us, let's say. But I myself always look at these protests where people are throwing stuff on people, on politicians, on museums, paintings, etc., and wonder whether that's the best way to do things. But then there is research about it that says people who look at extreme protests then support milder protests. Okay, so they say, oh, this is not good, but it's an important issue, so I will support protests that are more mild about voting for the candidate who doesn't support climate action, or standing and protesting about lack of climate action, etc. Perceived lack of skill was especially pronounced for advocacy, while a particular barrier for a protest was fear of repercussions. This I understand depending on where you are. Once scientists are willing to engage, practical barriers become more important than intellectual ones for actual engagement. Okay, so you overcome barriers and then you are saying, okay, I'm willing, but then practical barriers may become more important than intellectual ones. Only 3 intellectual barriers emerged in the second step: beliefs about the role of scientists, for example, to stay objective, you would avoid being in a protest or advocacy and protest, may reduce engagement in protests. Lack of knowledge about climate change may reduce engagement in both protests and advocacy, and also the feeling that one's own carbon footprint is too high may reduce the willingness to engage in both protests and advocacy. So you may say, I'm living a good life, why am I going to protest? So you are unwilling to make a change, or you are saying, I cannot reduce my carbon footprint enough to go and say others should do that too. Practical barriers for both advocacy and participating in protests include having no connections to advocates or activists, lack of time, lack of opportunities, and the fear of losing credibility. Fear of losing credibility is coming up a lot, so these are scientists who are worried about what is their role really if they have to jeopardize credibility for being in advocacy and protests. In addition, lack of skills and expertise emerged as a barrier to engaging in advocacy behavior. Key practical barriers such as lack of time, perceived lack of subject knowledge and skill, a perceived tension between science and advocacy activism, and lack of efficacy also emerged in previous studies on health professionals and scientists' scientists' barriers to engagement. Our findings suggest a number of routes to increase engagement of scientists, and that is given here. Several intellectual barriers could be addressed through outreach and education, facilitating interactions between scientists who are worried and engaged with those who are not. For example, at conferences can lead to critical reflection on the role and responsibility of scientists, increased understanding and motivation to engage, and also show pathways to engagement. So here we are trying to actively recruit and not necessarily debating the issue. We are saying if you have these barriers, we can help you overcome them. Connecting with scientists who engage in advocacy or activism could also resolve the barrier of not identifying with activists and disagreeing with the specific types of activist ideology. Today's students are tomorrow's scientists, and teaching courses on the planetary emergency and adequate responses in every curriculum could be a powerful tool to equip them to be agents of change. So, are we talking about change in general, or are we talking about climate change, agents of action on climate, right? So, because the protests about the Gaza let's say Israel conflict with Hamas resulted in lots of issues in the US. Other countries haven't reported such vast academic campus issues, and in the US thousands of students participated. Some were very disruptive, and none of the students actually put forth any plan to say this is how we would like this conflict to be resolved. So when multiple parties, in fact many parties, are involved in a conflict, if we are feeling bad about it and we want to protest and we have no suggestions and we are disrupting everybody else's academic track, then what are we doing? So it's complicated, right? While research suggests that loss of credibility due to advocacy depends on the advocated policy, available research suggests that such fears are largely unfounded. Existing work also suggests that protest and civil disobedience do not hurt credibility, but more research is needed. It's a belief that civil disobedience and protest may jeopardize one's credibility, but if you say there is no evidence for it, that's a barrier to overcome for the person, right? Communicating these findings to scientists who are worrying about this issue may thus increase their engagement. Finally, a very practical barrier that emerged is that many scientists simply do not know how to get started with advocacy or activism and do not know a local network they can connect to. This suggests that academic advocacy and activist movements should set up local groups within institutions to minimize the thresholds for scientists to engage. So this is proactively saying how to get more scientists in advocacy and protest engagement. Scientists who perceive they have an unsuitable personality for engaging in advocacy or protest can still provide critical support for climate advocacy groups in other ways. We hope that our discussion of strategies for overcoming barriers can help to increase scientists' engagement with climate change. So you read it, you decide for yourself, because engagement here is used and not activism, but it does involve protests and advocacy as main avenues of engagement. You can decide whether that is activism, that makes sense to you or not, and so on and so forth. So this is almost 30 minutes, so I'm going to leave it here. I'm just including this with the previous one, even though I agree more with the previous one. This one is saying saying that talking to scientists to figure out if they are interested and willing. If they are interested and willing, what are the barriers and how to overcome the barriers are okay. And it also tells people who read it about how institutions can help engage more of their scientists in climate change, engage in climate change. Let's just leave it there because I don't want to complain too much about this side of the advocacy. Well, we already said in the previous podcast that there are real scientific integrity issues that we have to worry about, because advocacy comes with an exaggerating things or over-reliance on scientific knowledge that is uncertain. Then it's a separate issue we have to deal with. Okay, let me leave it here.